Hello, everyone. Welcome to Human Genetics. This is the first chapter of this course. This chapter will focus on the information that is contained in the human genome. Now, as we dive in this chapter, we are going to address 5 major points. First and foremost, we are going to define what genetics is, and then we are going to look into the terms that are used commonly in this discipline. And then we are going to dive into the different levels of genetics and genomics. And then we're going to look at some applications. As we study genetics, what are some applications and how they apply also to genomics. And finally, we are going to take a look at a broader perspective, right? What are some impacts of getting all that knowledge on genetics and genomics? Without further ado, let's take a look at the first segment, a definition of genetics. What is genetics? Well, genetics, it's the study of inherited traits, their variations, and their transmission. So we are going to specifically ask, well, if we consider a particular gene that is responsible for a particular physical feature, such as the color of your hair, the shape of your hair, we are going to ask the following question. How did you get that feature from your parents, from your great-grandparents, right? And looking at the information that is contained in the human genome, studying all of that is going to give us a certain amount of information that we can actually use for many purposes. At the end of the day, genetics, it's a very powerful tool because it provides information pertaining to your identity, pertaining to who you are related to, and pertaining to what potentially you could be sensitive to in terms of developing diseases such as cancer, right? Even infections, believe it or not, right? We are going to address that. So human genetics, because of all the information that we can gather through the study of the human genome, we can apply human genetics in so many aspects, including forensics, which is the study of crimes, who committed a crime, who was not there. Actually, we've seen instances where people actually have been accused of a crime only to prove by A plus B, looking at genetic aspects, that this person was not at a crime, that another person who has been free so far is actually the person who was responsible for that crime, right? That's just an example. Genetics opens also aspects around bioethics, psychology, and even history. How are we related to people who existed before us, right? We learn more and more about ourselves and about our society through genetics. Now, today, we see that there is what we call consumer genetics. In consumer genetics, people like you and I can actually be curious to learn more about themselves and to use that information to their own benefit, right? Now, by isolating some cells from our body, analyzing the DNA contains in these cells, we can gather a large amount of information. Some people can find out that they are related to a celebrity, right? For instance, I am related to Vincent van Gogh, right? Who was a famous painter. You can learn that you have some family members, half brothers, half sisters that you were never aware of, right? You can learn that you are part Italian, 42%, 24% Ethiopian, 19% Swedish, and 14% Scottish in one single individual, right? And this is the result of a mix, people moving places and mating and producing offspring that at the end of the day produce a large mix of genetic information from very diverse background. So when we see people today and we try to classify them by so-called racial, ethnic background, we find that actually it doesn't make sense for many reasons that I'm not going to address here. Okay? We can find, based on the study of the genomes, that some people are prone to develop particular cancers, right? Prone to depression. And even we can show that, well, a particular treatment can work better or likely to work better in one individual versus another individual. One can trace their origins back to, for instance, American ancestry, right? To say that, okay, well, I'm this percent of Native American, right? This is very powerful information, but I'm not going to develop on some aspects how this is powerful. In any case, this is a very important source of information. Now, furthermore, about defining genetics, we have to be cautious because genetics, it's not genealogy. Genealogy, it's basically the study of how you are connected to your parents, to your grandparents, to your great grandparents. However, knowing that somebody was your grandparent or your great grandparent doesn't mean that you were indeed genetically related. Okay? You have to do genetics to actually find out that the person you consider or you know to be your grandfather or your great grandfather was indeed your great grandfather, or you thought he was, and socially, yes, he was, but genetically, he was not. But that's another story that I'm not going to dive into. So that today, when it comes to genetics, we talk about genetic genealogy. And in genetic genealogy, we don't just simply look at the relationship between people, we actually dive some more. We look at genes. Are you related genetically? If so, how? So that there is another term that we use, which is heredity. In heredity, we are studying the transmission of traits and biological information from one generation to another. Now, it is important to realize that not everything we see is defined by genetic factors. Very important to understand. Now, it is a fact that certain difficult to define human characteristics might appear to be inherited when they are actually not. For instance, if you have a mom who is infected with HIV, she ends up developing AIDS. Well, there is a chance that that mom can actually pass that affection to the very child she's bearing. And when the child is born, the child can be born with being HIV positive, right? That doesn't mean that this is by genetic makeup, but because you have exchange of fluid between mom and the newborn at birth, well, we can have the impression that the child inherited HIV from mom, while this is not genetics, right? Environment, plays also a very important role in there. Now let's take a look at some terminologies. And these terminologies allows you to also realize that, well, when looking at genetics, we have to look at genetics at different levels. Now, first, let's define a gene. What is a gene? A gene is a set of instruction, a genetic sequence that is basically the alignment of nucleotides. We're going to define nucleotides a little later. This alignment of nucleotides account for the production of a particular protein. Okay? So any segment of genetic information that account for the production of a protein at the end of the day, that protein that is going to cause an individual to exhibit a particular trait, this is actually what we are going to call a gene, right? A gene, it's a unit of the genetic information that is going to be responsible for the production of a particular protein, right? And that protein can be a functional protein, it can be a structural protein, but that's another story. But before I move on, when I talk about structural protein, I'm thinking, for instance, about the proteins that make up your hair. Your hair is very structural, right? By the same token, you are going to have proteins that are going to be functional. These proteins that are functional are, for instance, enzymes. You don't see enzyme, but you do see the outcome of an enzymatic reaction, right? So, now the genes are made up of nucleotides, right? These nucleotides themselves make up the deoxyribonucleic acid DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. This deoxyribonucleic acid is made up of nucleotides that are adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine in the case of DNA. So we're going to see some of these details a little later. Now, going back, the genes are contained in DNA, right? And that DNA actually is going to make up the genome. The genome is the complete set of genetic information. Now, when you consider a given individual with many tissues, many organs, many cells, these cells actually contain two sets of genetic information. One set you receive from mom and one set you receive from dad, so that a given cell in your body is considered to have two genomes. Question though, what is a cell? We define a cell as the basic unit of life. That basic unit of life is this very smallest component of a living system that carry all the characteristics of life. In other words, a cell is able to reproduce, just like you are able to reproduce. A cell is able to use energy, just like you are able to use energy, right? A cell is able to adapt, a cell is able to evolve, and so on and so forth. So the cell is the smallest component of a living system that still carry all the characteristics that make that living thing alive. Now, going a little further beyond genomes and cells, we have exomes. What is an exome? An exome, it's the part of the genome that specifically is responsible for the production of the proteins. Understand that not all segments of the genome account for proteins. No, not all segments of the genome account for proteins. Only a limited amount of the genome is responsible for the existence of proteins. This part of the genome that causes proteins to exist is what we call exome. Now, genomics, it's another term that we use in genetics. Genomics actually is specific in a sense that it compares and analyzes different genomes, how they are related. For instance, when you consider people who live in New Philadelphia and people, say, who live in Australia, how do they compare in terms of genomics? Are their genomes exactly the same? Or are there some variations? If so, what are these variations? Right? Now, I was telling you earlier about consumer genetics. Now, consumer genetics go with a number of questions. And these questions are basically around bioethics. Well, bioethics is going to address issues and controversies that develop because of the use of genetics, because of new technologies, right? Say, for instance, you want to know your origins, and you approach a biotech company, they isolate your DNA, and they come up with some information, and they're going to tell you that you are 50%, I'm just saying anything, Italian, 50% Gabonese, 50% Nigerian, 50% Chinese. I'm just saying anything, right? But this is not only the only information they are going to learn by looking at your DNA. They're going to learn much, much more than that. They're going to learn if there is a chance that you're going to develop diabetes throughout your life. They're going to learn, they're going to know if you can be, you can develop a cervical cancer, if you can develop cystic fibrosis, and so on and so forth. Now, the question is, what are this company going to do with that information? That's one. Two, it's when you receive that information, where are you keeping that information? Are you keeping that information on a cell phone? Who is your cell phone carrier? Is your cell phone carrier going to be able to know what your genetic makeup is? Now, let's shift gears and address insurance companies. Will insurance companies, health insurance companies, would they know what disease you are likely to develop through your lifetime or not? How are they going to use that information if they stumble upon that information? Who is responsible for guarding your information? There are a lot of bioethics questions around genetics that you have to be aware of and that are very important to think about, not just at individual level, but also at the level of a nation, right? Because that information is going somewhere, right? What if there is a breach in that information? Okay? I'm not talking necessarily about consumer genetics. How about what is done in hospitals, right? Where legitimately they want to treat a particular affection, right? So they dive into running some analysis. They get that information, but that information they got, would that information allow them to actually find out about your mom, your dad, your grandparents, your great grandparents? How about tomorrow? Can they predict that your offspring may be prone to such or such infection or condition? These are questions that are legitimate, that actually open questions around bioethics.